Thank you very much for inviting me along. This has been great. I've had a very warm welcome to Australia. It's actually the first time I've been to Australia. As you can hear, I'm not from here. I'm from Scotland. And what's been interesting is since I got here last week, everyone's been complaining about how cold it is. And I'm going, nope. I did. I did get off the plane the first day, checked my stuff into the hotel, and I went out wearing shorts, t-shirt, and my flip-flops or thongs. And it was maybe a little too cold for that. I was maybe a little bit ambitious, but the weather hasn't really lived up to Australia's reputation. But it's been a lovely week so far. And even at this conference, when I came out of the Hipster Whale keynote this morning, it was interesting coming upstairs. The stairs were busier than the escalator. Everyone was queuing to come up the stairs. You don't get that at GDC either, do you? One of the things I loved about that talk was it Clara from Hipster Whale talking about them trying to find the next Crossy Road. And I was actually at the talk that I think it's Matt from Hipster Whale gave at GDC in 2015, just after the game had launched. And he was talking about them wanting to find the next Flappy Bird, but recognising that it wasn't going to be Flappy Bird, whereas everyone else was just doing Flappy Bird clones. So I love the fact that they've created something that's way bigger than Flappy Bird, but they recognise they still need to transcend it themselves. So I've been really impressed with the talks in the conference in general, as you can probably tell. Before I start, Clara did a quick poll of our audience and reckoned it was about a third of people had been in the games industry for more than 10 years. So I'd just be interested to hear, how many people have been in the industry for more than 10 years? Oh, that's smaller than a third. Okay, let's go with 10% or something. How many people are in the industry? Okay. How many people are not in the industry but hoping to get in? Maybe students or... Okay. And then everyone else is in the wrong room or something? Maybe, yeah. Okay, no, that's super interesting. Thank you. To properly introduce myself, my name is Colin Macdonald. I have been in the games industry for, I think this is my 35th year. As you can tell, I'm an old guy. I'm not used to going to a conference and seeing so many full heads of hair. Australia's a nice young industry. It's great. I started in the early 90s working on 8-bit software in the bedroom in my mum's house, basically. Ended up working at a little company called DMA Design in Scotland. How many people have heard of DMA Design? Oh, a decent number. Okay, so we made various games, the most famous of which went on to be Grand Theft Auto. So I was producer on the first two Grand Theft Autos. The first one came out in it was actually October 1997. So that's 27 years. This is going to make me feel really old. 27 years since the first Grand Theft Auto came out. So I'm hoping to be back here in 17 years for the 27-year anniversary of Crossy Road, which would be great. After that, I was studio manager of another studio in Dundee, which did a game called Crackdown on the Xbox. Has anyone played Crackdown? Oh, quite a lot. Awesome, thank you. So I was only working on the first one, didn't work on the second or third rubbish ones, just the good one. We grew that studio up to about 300 people, which in my hometown of Dundee was... the city only had a population of 150,000 people, so we were a massive employer in a relatively small city, and we were going on to great things. Crackdown was a big success and everything. Then we got a number of things spectacularly wrong and went bust, and I was laid off like everyone else, unfortunately. Luckily enough, in my 35 years, that's the one and only time I've been laid off in this industry. I know there's some people who have been laid off a bunch of times, so I actually consider myself incredibly lucky, having only been laid off once, which tells you something about the nature of this industry. I then went on to the TV broadcaster Channel 4 Television in the UK. So I was their games commissioner for 6 or 7 years, where I was basically commissioning games based on our TV shows. So this was a really fun job because I was kind of 1 foot outside the games industry, looking at all these TV shows. It wasn't as glamorous as you think. I wasn't really mingling with all the celebs and everything, but I was basically looking across all the TV shows and the upcoming shows, and then trying to figure out what games to commission to match the audience that the TV shows were going to have. So as part of that, my remit was to commission games across the UK. So I ended up spending a lot of my time outside of just Scotland, and I got to know pretty much everyone across the whole of the UK's development scene. So basically, I've kind of seen a little bit of most aspects of the games industry over my time in it, from development to publishing to indie to AAA to wild success to dismal failure. Kind of been there and had a little taste of it all. These days, I do a few different things. I consult for a couple of the Scottish games and tech companies. I run a much more modest conference in Scotland twice a year, just to provide a focus to get publishers to visit Scotland and hopefully do business with us. I also run something called the Content Fund, which is run by the UK Games Fund, which is a £5 million, so about 10 million Australian dollar fund for UK developers. And the main aim of that has been job creation. We won't fund anyone unless they can sort of convince us that they're going to create additional jobs for the UK's games industry as a result. So basically, last few years, I've been either the most popular person or the least popular person in the industry, depending on whether you're one of the applications that's been successful or not. And then over COVID, does this clicker work? This clicker does work, fantastic. Over COVID, when everyone else was learning to play guitar or bake sourdough bread or whatever it was, I couldn't hide my inner geek, and I started running online recruitment events because I recognised that everyone that was looking to get into the industry, all their traditional ways in had been disrupted, and all the studios I was speaking to in Scotland and around the rest of the UK didn't know how to get in touch with people either. So we ran dozens and dozens of online recruitment events that helped countless people get into the industry. We then supplemented these with other things like game jams and job boards and all sorts of online resources, just to provide as much help as we could for the community. But what I'm really here today to talk about is something that was a result of my being intrigued by some of the clearly unsustainable bonkers hiring that I saw going on in the UK as a result. So I basically started collecting data on all the jobs that were being advertised in the UK's games industry at any one time. And I did this initially intended as it was a games map. Here's your jobs, and you can sort of zoom into your city and explore where the jobs are and everything. But that didn't get any interest whatsoever. But we put it into a 6-page report and just sort of sliced and diced the data by category, by seniority, by studio, by discipline, etc. And that short report ended up getting a lot of traction. It ended up getting shared a lot on LinkedIn and social media. It ends up getting shared with UK and Scottish governments, etc. So in the UK, we've pulled that data every single month for almost the past 4 years now, refreshing it and able to see how it's changed month by month over that time. And for the past 2 years, after meeting IGEA out at Gamescom a couple of years ago, they've helped us put together Australian data. So for the last 2 years, we've got this data for Australia as well. Just to summarise how we do that, we create the data. Basically, we have a bunch of automated scraping scripts that sit in the cloud. When we push a button, that runs around as many of the websites as technology allows, scrapes a ton of those jobs, basically the job title, the location and the company. We can then derive from that what discipline it is by analysing the job title, what city and state it is, because we've looked into the company separately. We've not been able to write scripts for everything because some websites are more complicated than others, so we then have a manual researcher person that comes in behind and has to manually collect all the job data from all the companies that we've not been able to collect, as well as importing all that data into a custom tool that we've got that then flags up anything that looks suspicious, because sometimes our scraper breaks or a website gets updated. So if a company suddenly creates double the number of jobs they had the previous month, or hardly any, or even if a company's job numbers remain completely static for too many months in a row, this tool sort of flags it up as suspicious, and the researcher then goes in and just double checks all that data. That then gets passed off to an editor who sanity checks it all, writes up some learnings and trends from it. It then gets passed to me as a third pair of eyes on it, and once we're all happy with it, that then gets published into the reports that IGEA publish every month. How many people have seen one of those reports that have come out from IGEA? Oh, okay, quite a few haven't. Okay, well, they're easily accessible, so you can get them afterwards. But what's interesting is that some of the changes that we see are a reaction to the industry. So when we've seen interest rates change, that affects studios' abilities to get funding. When we've seen layoffs, when we've seen acquisitions, that often changes a company's pattern in hiring. But it can also be a leading indicator as well, that we've seen a few examples where we've noticed a strange change in a company's recruiting, and then it's only weeks or a month or two later we realise why. Often because one of those things has happened. They've actually been acquired, or they've had a project cancelled or something. And the last couple of months, we've even been able to start to surmise sort of status updates about projects. There's a very large game, which I'm no longer associated with, due out next year, that is currently advertising quite a lot of content positions, but hardly any QA or localization positions. And I'm looking at that going, is that game really coming out next year? That doesn't feel like the mix of people you would be hiring if you've spent 10 years working on a game and you're in the last 10% of production. But I'm not involved anymore. And who knows what that game is? Nobody can guess, I guess, you know? So we're actually able to glean quite a lot of insights out of what are otherwise just numbers. So looking at Australia, here's the number of vacancies for September, state by state. What was interesting to me was just how much all the jobs were focused in the city hubs within each state. So between Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide and Brisbane, they represent most of the jobs in the whole of the state, which is someone from outside of Australia, you just have no sense. Here is how the job numbers have varied in Australia for the past 2 years. So currently there's 111 jobs. If you go back to January 23 when we started collecting this, there was 216 jobs. Now, that's basically a 50% drop in job numbers, which on the face of it seems like quite a scary drop. But given all the challenges the industry has had and is still facing at the moment, I think it's actually okay. I'd wanted to see if there was any trends around some of the higher profile layoffs in Australia, so I've put in dotted lines for the announcements around Fire Monkeys, League of Geeks and Mighty Kingdom. But as you can see, there's not really much variation around there, and overall since that initial drop from the COVID bubble, the Australian market has stayed pretty steady now for about 18 months, kind of just going up and down within, sort of 20 or 30 jobs month by month. After I started collating the numbers for this talk, I realised some of the most interesting comparisons might actually be comparing how the Australian and the UK market compare directly. So the line in red here is the UK's job numbers. These go back 4 years because we've been collecting the data for a little bit longer, with the Australian numbers, the same numbers as the previous slide in blue there. What's good about this for the UK is that it captures the sort of peak nonsense of the COVID bubble, when everyone was getting carried away and thinking every game's going to be the next fortnight and everything. I would love to have been capturing this data pre-COVID. But the thing about this data is, if you don't capture it month by month live, it's gone forever, because everyone's websites get updated. So at least we've been able to capture it for the last 4 years and 2 years in Australia. And it also shows that although that 50% drop in job numbers in Australia sounds like quite a lot, if you look at the UK numbers, they peaked at about 2,700 back in summer of 2022. They're now down at 719, I think it is. So that's a drop of about 3/4 in the UK that we've seen. So Australia's drop of 50% actually isn't that bad compared to the UK. So this, this sort of chimes with the fact that for the last 18 months, the market here has seemed relatively stable, whereas if you look at the same last 18 months for the UK, it's still been plummeting. It's practically halved just in the time since the Australian market has stabilised out. What's not, actually, before I say that, what's not practical to track is, these are just the vacancies. We're not tracking who's employed at the studio or how many people are getting jobs or losing jobs. We're purely looking at the vacancies. There'd be different data. I imagine it would mostly correlate the job numbers. Things tend to go hand in hand. Bigger studios end up employing more people, have more turnover, more jobs to advertise. But it's not to say anything we're talking about today is actually representative of where the studios are and whether they're growing. Although the jobs have stabilised over the last 18 months here, it's entirely possible the studios have increased in size tenfold or decreased in size tenfold. That's not what this captures. And typically when the numbers were high, all the recruiters were complaining about the level of competition. In the UK, 2,700 jobs. Someone that's on the jobs market is kind of spoilt for choice. So the recruiters were having a nightmare. Salaries would go through the roof. Whereas now, when there's far fewer jobs on the market, people aren't shopping around for jobs as much. If they're in a good job, they tend to stay there because they know things are so uncertain. So the recruiters aren't happy now either. They never seem to be happy. It's either too competitive or there's not enough people going around. Whereas if you think about it from a wider industry point of view, or an individual point of view, if somebody gets hired, that actually takes away one of the vacancies. So somebody, our numbers go down month by month sometimes, and a lot of people say, "Oh, that's terrible, the numbers are down." And you're like, "Well, actually, those are people being hired. This is great. Those people have jobs that they didn't before." And then, even when the numbers go up and there's more vacancies, it still seems like good news because there's more jobs around for more people. So it's kind of a win-win, unless you're a recruiter who seems to always find the downsides and things. But that's fine. That's okay. This is the page of our reports that everybody all the studios tend to clamour to want to get on. So this is where we basically just list the studios in order of which ones have the most vacancies. We do some work filtering out some jobs. This doesn't really happen in Australia, but in the UK, we'll get some, particularly service companies, will list the same job in 6 different locations. We think just to sort of increase the virality of it and to increase the chances of capturing a local person to make the job appeal to them. We don't really have to do the same in Australia. So these are the companies that have got the most positions at the moment. And what's interesting is to see how this changes over time. In the UK, a lot of our companies got crazily carried away with COVID. I mean, they were just punch drunk on the thought of free money coming in from everywhere. So we had companies that would top this chart, like Epic and Unity and Sumo. In any given month, they would have 130, 150 vacancies just in the UK. But what's been interesting is that they now don't appear on this page whatsoever. You know, they just have a couple of vacancies because they've sobered up and realised it was all nonsense. Whereas if I go back and look at this same page for the last 2 years in Australia, it's actually not that different. That top line with Riot, Big Ant, Foxy, Playside, Tantalus, they were all in the top half of this report 1 year ago and 2 years ago. It seems pretty consistent and stable here. Even throughout the rest of those companies on that page, there's not actually a huge change month to month and year on year. There's some of them come and go, you know, EA, depending on Fire Monkey's announcements and everything. Is it Immutable? Some of their jobs tend to jump around quite a lot, but by and large, a lot of the companies, if they're hiring, they're always hiring. So the impression I'm getting of the Australian market is one of stability, certainly over the last 18 months. That being relative, of course, I understand there's been huge upset here as there has everywhere else as well. Here we have a look at the discipline split across the Australian jobs. So these are current. So you can basically see 38% of the jobs at the moment are programming, 28% art. No huge surprises there, with sort of 2/3 of jobs being the 2 largest disciplines. Design then coming up as next biggest at 12%, and the other disciplines sitting somewhere 5 up to 5%. What I thought was interesting was then to compare this to the UK disciplines. So the Australia split is the same on the left as the previous slide. If you compare it to the one on the right, you see the code jobs in blue are roughly the same. Both have sort of 38-40% of jobs being programming. The art split is very different though. In the UK, it's only 18% of jobs are in art versus 28% in Australia. And then the other one that's massively different is production, where in Australia it's just 5%, but in the UK it's 10%. So again, this doesn't mean that only 5 or 10% of people actually working in the industry are in production. This is just the vacancies. And in fact, my own suspicion is that the reason we've got so many jobs in production going in the UK at the moment is because of the realisation since COVID that there wasn't enough adult supervision in our industry. And we're compensating a little bit. I don't think I'll get too many arguments about that. And this is how it varies over the last couple of years. Obviously, the longer we do this, the more interesting the trends get. Because we're just doing it for 2 years, we've basically got 3 data points, going back 2 years, 1 year, and now. So you can see in Australia, like Code has stayed fairly static at around 40%, was slightly over, now slightly under. So no huge change in the portion of code jobs that are going. The two that are particularly interesting are art in red. That has jumped from 21% of positions 2 years ago up to 28% just now, which proportionate-wise is a massive change, especially given the volume involved there. And then you can see production, the yellow line, blue, red, and then yellow. Production jobs have actually dropped massively from 10% 2 years ago down to just 5% at the moment. So again, to me, and I'm maybe biased because I'm healthily cynical about the UK market, but to me, this is sort of reinforcing that the Australian market is maybe a bit more organised, or the teams are a bit more organised than we are. It'll be interesting to get everyone's perspective afterwards. And then if we look at the subsectors, so whether the jobs are in what we deem AAA, AA, indie mobile, etc., the rough sort of rule of thumb on this is that if, it maybe isn't true anymore, but a game that I would have expected to appear in the shops physically, like in a big supermarket, you know, your Call of Duties and everything, we've classified as AAA. You know, AA is sizable budget. Indie is, you know, anything up to sort of a team of 10 people. So if we compare Australia to the UK, these graphs are very, very different. So in particular, over half of the UK's jobs are in AAA. And this might explain why we also got so carried away over COVID, because everyone thought, oh, our game can be the next Fortnite or the, you know, the next GTA or whatever. So because our industry has more AAA studios, that might be the case there. However, we've got a lot fewer AA, indie and mobile jobs going, relatively speaking. What was interesting was that the service industries between both don't change that much. So to me, that suggests that Australia doesn't have as big a service industry as the UK does. So it suggests that the jobs here are more sort of core development focused, that the studios are making their own jobs rather than being a service brought in or outsourced from somewhere else, compared to a lot of the jobs that we have in the UK. All those, and here's the graph looking at it historically. So if you look at the blue line, that's the AAA line. So although Australia's AAA jobs were fewer than the UK's, you can see that over the last couple of years, that's actually taken a huge jump up. I've forgotten the number in my exact notes, but it looks like roughly between sort of 12% of jobs 2 years ago, up to about 20% these days in AAA, whilst the other sectors, the AA and indie and mobile, have come down proportionately. So that increase in AAA jobs is great for all the people that want to work in AAA games. Not everyone does, but as we'll see later on, it's increasingly hard to get that first step into the job market in general, and particularly into AAA. We don't yet track working practices in Australia, but just out of interest, here's the numbers that we're tracking for the UK for the moment. So basically, the number on the top right, 61% is jobs that require some on-site presence. So that's either fully on-site or hybrid. About half of those need you to be fully on-site, the other half are hybrid. And then quite a high percentage, it's 36%, that number in the top left, is the number of jobs that can be available fully remote. And what's interesting in the UK is that that's been fairly stable over the last 12 months. It was obviously plummeting as we came out of COVID and studios were figuring out their working models. But over the last 12 months, studios seem to have tended to keep with whatever model they've ended up with, whether they've been completely happy with it or not, or might still change. But it stayed relatively stable. And then that bottom row of numbers, that's looking at the split by studio rather than by job. So the top one is by whether each individual job is available on-site or remote. The bottom one is just looking at the studios. So this does skew more remote friendly because there tends to be more of the smaller studios are remote friendly, but they don't have as many jobs typically going as the larger studios that have asked people to come back to an office. So both interesting stats, and hopefully we'll get that for Australia at some point as well. These are the top 10 most common roles that we're seeing in Australia. The numbers currently on the left, the job titles currently on the left, and then the ones on the right are from 2 years ago. And what was really surprising about this, again, much more so than compared to the UK, was the stability. The ones in green are basically the same positions that are just as much in demand now as they were 2 years ago. The ones in yellow are fairly similar in many ways. And it's only those three in white that have dramatically changed the product manager, assistant producer, and producer roles that were popular 2 years ago don't appear in the top 10 list now. So again, this kind of reinforces this sense I've had that Australia's got itself a bit more organised and has got those production roles in place, and is now looking for those other roles, the QA and the art roles, that it wasn't quite as much. And then, as a final comparison to the UK, there's also a remarkable similarity in the split of the seniority of jobs. So in blue, those are jobs available to people with any experience. Basically, the red is senior, so that's typically 5 years plus experience. Management jobs in yellow and junior jobs in green. The UK skews slightly more on looking for more senior people, but the experienced jobs are broadly speaking similar given the skills involved. But both of them have just a tiny number of jobs open to juniors. In the UK on the right, it's 13 jobs out of over 700 jobs going at the moment that are open to juniors, and in Australia, it's just 3 out of 111 jobs. And if you look at the seniority split for Australia over the last couple of years, most of these numbers haven't changed that much, relatively speaking. The experienced senior and management roles broadly stayed the same. However, the junior split, although it's not immediately obvious from the chart just because of the scale, that's actually dropped from 7% of jobs 2 years ago were open to juniors down to under 3%. Now, I don't know the number of graduates that come out of college and university in Australia every year, but in the UK, it's something like 3,500 people graduate every single year from a games-related degree, not including everything else and all the people that don't go through university. 3,500 people every year in the UK looking to get into the games industry. And we have 13 jobs at the moment. Okay, that's only 1 month, but even so, it's a massive uphill struggle, and I imagine it's the same here, looking at the scale of the numbers. So, looking at all that, one of the things we want to do is try and figure out, what are the common trends, what are the common skills and everything. So you look at all that and you realise the single most sought after skill to have to get a job in the games industry is, any suggestions? Experience. It's that classic irony, and every graduate complains about, how do I get the job? my first job that needs 3 years experience or needs me to have shipped two titles. And it is a catch-22. But my advice for if there's those in the room that are looking to get that first job, there are solutions. None of them are easy, none of them are quick, but there are solutions. It basically boils down to create your own experience. There's a number of things you can do. Don't apply to jobs with the same CV as everyone else. If you're graduating from a course with 30 other students that have been through the same course, done the same modules, done the same projects, how is a studio going to pick you over your 29 other colleagues? You need to make sure your CV stands out. You need to work on both your solo and teamwork projects. Different studios, different phases of projects, different types of teams will sometimes do a lot more work in teams. Sometimes they'll need people to be able to work in isolation. So you want to be able to demonstrate that you're capable of going off and just working on something by yourself for a period of time, and that you can play well with others, so that if you get put in a big team, you're going to do well. With all the recruitment events we did, the single most important bit of advice that kept coming back when people were asking what can they do to improve their CV, the recruiters would always say game jams. It's the reason we run game jams, to give people an excuse to get that extra experience. Game jams can be done in a day, a weekend, a week, a year, any length of time with any size of team. So I'm always encouraging people to take part in game jams. Modding, often even simpler, but I would also recommend people do it as well as game jams, because it gives you experience of another established game, another engine that's out there, experience of working with a community that already has expectations and norms. And it can be much more like working on a live service game, whereas game jam, you run the risk of just creating something very niche. And both are super useful skills, but it's worth thinking about them separately. And I definitely encourage people to self-publish a game. It's so easy, so cheap, relatively speaking, whether it's Google Play or Steam. It's unlikely to sell millions of copies, but you never know. But just that experience of going through it, that is going to be valuable to employers. And you might surprise yourself. You might end up getting a bit of traction. The talk earlier by, I've forgotten his name, from the Memento game, he was basically saying, even if you don't think your game's going to do brilliantly, if you're 90% through development, just finish it and ship it, because you gain valuable experience. But almost more than that, other people see that you have that experience. You have a shipped game on your title. You don't have to confess that it only sold 7 copies. Get that game out there. And there's a bunch of soft skills people can work on as well. It's great to see so many people helping out at GCAP here. Not everyone can afford to give up tons of time to volunteer, but it's a great way of networking. So look for ways that you can network with your local community, whether it's online, it could just be moderating a Discord or something like this, or helping out at in-person events. Just the more you do, the bigger your network will be. The more people that know you and your work, the more chances you have that someone will think of you when a position opens up. Be enthusiastic. The number of times I've heard from an interviewer or a scout at a publisher that says, well, they weren't very enthusiastic about themselves or their project, so how do they expect anyone else to be enthusiastic about them? And I'm not a great example of this. I can be a bit Scottish doer, as we say, but you want to be enthusiastic about yourself, your skills, and your projects. You also want to be very selective. Don't just include everything you've done in your portfolio. Part of what you're showing off is your ability to be self-critical, that if you're in a job, your team will expect you to recognise when something you've done isn't your best work and you need to do better. So you want to demonstrate that through your portfolio. So only include your best stuff in your portfolio, regardless how proud of it you are. You need to look at your own portfolio objectively. Check your CV or resume. Make sure there's nothing stupid in there. You don't talk about other companies. The 10-second CV test is something that I'm trying to get more people to think about. I once was hiring for a position, and it was a single position. I had something like 200 CVs come in for this position. And before I started looking at these CVs, I thought, right, I'm going to give each one of these, I'm going to do this properly and fairly. I'll give each one of these CVs a proper read through and everything. And you quickly realize it's just not possible. I've got a million other things to do. And I think the official stat is that when recruiting at that sort of scale, the average CV gets 7 seconds in a first pass. And you just can't take in everything in 7 seconds. And it's not meant to. What it's meant to do is just within those 7 seconds, someone is deciding, is this worth spending a few minutes on? Because you can't spend a few minutes on hundreds of CVs. So what I recommend people do, take your CV, give it to somebody that doesn't know your work history particularly well, let them look at it, take it off them after 10 seconds and ask them what they remember about it. And if it's not what you hoped they would remember, look at your CV, reformat it, structure it, change the headings, whatever it is. You want people to be able to look at your CV in 10 seconds and go, oh, wow, they're brilliant at X, Y, and Z, you know? Put yourself in recruiter's shoes. This is kind of obvious stuff, but sometimes it's good just to hear about it. You want to think, what is a recruiter, a team particularly going to be looking for? What's a red flag to them? What are they not going to want to hear? Learn the industry. The number of people in Scotland I speak to that I'll say to them, oh yeah, which local companies do you think you might want to work for? And they say, oh well, I don't really know the local companies around here. I was kind of hoping to work for, you know, Naughty Dog or Nintendo. And I'm like, yeah, they're not in Scotland. You've got far less chance if you don't even know who the local employers are. You don't have to know them intimately, you don't have to stalk them on social media or anything, but just have an awareness of who's doing what around you and where you're most likely to end up. Take feedback graciously. That you're not always going to get feedback. When you do, you're not always going to agree with it. But what I'd recommend is not getting too defensive and making it difficult for people to give you honest feedback. It might not be right. It might be right, but you might disagree with it. But just encourage the feedback, take it. If you don't agree, just say, well, I'm not sure I agree, but thanks anyway. You know, and then that way it doesn't leave a bitter taste in anyone's mouth. And you, even if you choose to ignore it, at least have some feedback you can take on board or dismiss going forward. And the single biggest bit of advice is just to be persistent. This is a difficult industry to get in because it's quite an aspirational industry. I've stuck with it for so long because I do think it's worthwhile. I've had some amazing experiences, some terrible experiences as well, but overall it has been great fun, and I wouldn't do anything else. Well, I can't do anything else, but and then to the studio side of things, if there's recruiters or studio heads, I would basically say we need to invest more in training. That rather than waiting until we're desperate for people with experience to come along, we just need to think a little bit further ahead of time. So give people time to be trained up, hire juniors earlier so that when you need them, they are those people with experience that are half the jobs that we're looking for, not the 3%. So you have this talent internally, make some training budget available. It doesn't have to be a lot. To be honest, the bigger consideration is going to be the time rather than the cash cost, because there's a million tools out there, resources, books, online sessions. It's freeing up the time to let those people get trained up. Assign mentors internally. This isn't something I see happen very much in the UK, but I see it in other grown-up industries a lot more, where you can get someone that wants to give something back, sort of take a junior under their wing within the same company, or sometimes from another company. I've seen some hubs do sort of cross-company mentoring that's been quite valuable, and take more chances on internal promotions. the number of people, because I'm now an old guy in the industry, the number of people that I think back historically, and I was maybe a little bit dismissive of, going, oh, you're just a whatever, and they're now far smarter, far more senior, paid way more than me, and actually they just needed the chance, they just needed the right opportunity. So definitely give folk opportunities, and you'll, not always, but you'll usually be surprised how much people can step up into roles that you didn't know they were capable of. For those of you that said that you already get the monthly reports via IGEA, then they'll continue to come through. If for any reason you're not getting those, I've got a mailing list. You can get them directly if you go to australia.gamesjobs.live. Stick your email in there, and I will get them out to you as they're published. Just before we wrap up, I think we had a few minutes for questions, maybe, if we've got any questions. A couple of questions. We'll get a microphone just so everyone can hear. Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. In your stats, you drew some information from, like, you could look up the company and get other information about them. How do you manage that when companies are acquiring other companies and stuff like that? Doesn't that bounce those numbers around over time, or?
Yeah, and this is where it kind of helps not being, some of these surveys and everything that are sort of government commissioned, and I don't know how I can see why they can only do one report a year, because I think they spend 11 months arguing about this precise definitions. Whereas at the end of the day, although I run everything past the folks I deal with at IGEA, at the end of the day, I'm sort of going, you know what, this could go either way, but let's put it this way for this. So we'll have to make a call on whether a company is a company in its own right, or it's part of a bigger group, or whether it's even a games company. Our general rule is that if you bumped into a member of staff from the company and you asked what industry they're in, we want them to say they're in the games industry, whereas somebody could work for a PR agency that does some games work, but if you bumped into them in the street, they're not going to pick the games industry to say they work on. So we're looking for people that feel like they're focused on games. So there's a few subjective things like that, but luckily we have the flexibility that we can just go, you know what, this might not be 100% right every single time, but we'll get it out every month, and to me that's a bigger advantage. There's a question somewhere in the middle.
Hey, with the jobs on a per month basis, how do you guys handle jobs that carry across multiple months? You might have a position that's open up for more than a single month. Do they just get discounted, or does it carry across? Or
no, they carry across. Yeah. Okay. So the only ones we need to be wary of is some companies, particularly smaller companies, will put up 3 jobs, and then 6 months later we're like, those 3 jobs have been up there for 6 months. This is starting to look like you've just not updated your website. So we'll discount those sometimes if we think the job's not real.
So the scraper does its work, but then you have someone kind of check over the data to
Yep.
kind of confirm.
Yep.
Yeah, cool.
Perfect. We've got one last question and then we'll wrap up down at the front here. I should have picked people in opposite corners.
Sorry. No, thank you for the talk. It was super insightful. Why, in your opinion, do you think there are only just crumbs of junior jobs and not any more, I suppose? Like, everyone's looking for a senior or a mid sort of range producer, blah, 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 whatnot, but there's hardly any junior jobs out there. Why do you think that is?
I mean, it's that thing about us always being short term, that if I'm running a studio and I've got a deadline to meet, I just need experienced people I can trust to come in and fill it. And to do anything else requires me to invest time and effort and a headspace 6 months ahead of time. I do think, this industry has existed for decades now. We should know better. So I don't, particularly if you're a bigger company that can afford it, to put that little bit of investment into juniors earlier on, I really have very little sympathy when they're saying, oh, we can't get anyone with any experience. I'm like, folks, you've had years. You could have been training these folk up, and then you would have had them already on your books. So they have no excuses, and it's sheer short-sightedness or greed that they. In fact, it's not even greed, because they're kind of saving money by not hiring them, but then they're having to pay over the odds because they have to pay a recruitment agency, and then they have to pay more to hire someone externally compared to the cost of someone that's already internally. So it's short-sightedness mostly. But yeah, I think there is stuff we can do. I think we're out of time. Thank you very much. If you want to get in touch, my email is there, or I'm on Meet to Match.